shared outhouses or communal spaces, but Victorian modesty demanded separation. By carving out specialized rooms for chamber pots and later for water closets, architects reshaped domestic space around the principle of bodily privacy. Today, the bathroom is one of the most private rooms in any home, an inheritance of Victorian morality. The language of euphemism. Even now, we rarely speak bluntly about toilets. We use the restroom, visit the facilities, or simply freshen up. These linguistic dances are descendants of the Victorian obsession with euphemism, when to even mention a chamber pot was considered vulgar. The polite evasions of today are echoes of the whispers of yesterday. The silent servant's legacy. While most of us no longer rely on maids to empty chamber pots, the invisibility of bathroom labor remains. Sewage workers, plumbers, and sanitation crews perform essential, unglamorous tasks that society still prefers not to see. The Victorian hierarchy, where the refined remained untouched by the dirty realities of their own waste, has not entirely vanished, only shifted to different hands. Ornament and concealment. The Victorian love of disguise, hiding chamber pots inside fine furniture, has its modern counterpart in design. Even the sleekest contemporary bathrooms often strive for elegance that conceals function. Gleaming fixtures, soft lighting, scented air fresheners all serve the same purpose: to make the unavoidable realities of the body less visible, less raw. Technology and status. Just as early adopters of water closets flaunted their modernity, today luxury bathrooms, heated floors, spa showers, smart toilets are status symbols. To invest in plumbing comfort is still a declaration of refinement, convenience, and wealth. The porcelain revolution of the 19th century planted the seed for today's bathroom as a stage of lifestyle and prestige. Perhaps most importantly, the Victorians left us with the paradox that still defines our relationship to the bathroom. The body is universal, but its needs must remain private. Every flush, every locked door, every perfumed candle speaks to a tension inherited from an age that sought to master modesty. The bathroom may now be cleaner, quieter, and more efficient, but the ghosts of chamber pots and whispered euphemisms remain. Each time we retreat into the privacy of a tiled, locked space, we step into a legacy shaped as much by Victorian anxieties as by modern plumbing. The story of Victorian bathroom culture may seem quaint, even absurd. We laugh at the image of ladies balancing hoops over chamber pots, at euphemisms so delicate they bend language into knots, at furniture designed to pretend that the body did not exist. And yet, beneath the comedy lies something deeply human. The Victorians remind us that the bathroom is not just a place of necessity, it is a stage where society's deepest anxieties play out. Modesty, morality, privacy, class, labor, technology. Each leaves its trace in porcelain, wood, and ritual. A chamber pot was never just a pot. It was a vessel of status, silence, and secrecy. Today, we flush away without a thought. The labor is hidden in pipes, the odors masked by scents, the shame softened by euphemism, but the patterns remain. We still carry the Victorian instinct to conceal, to euphemize, to lock a door against the gaze of others. Their ghosts live in the language we use, the design of our homes, and the unspoken rules of our lives. To trace the history of the chamber pot is in the end to trace the history of how we deal with what makes us most human. The Victorians may have buried their reality beneath layers of lace and mahogany, but in doing so, they gave us something enduring, the modern idea of privacy. And so, the next time you close a bathroom door, whether in a humble flat or a luxury suite, you are participating in a legacy centuries in the making, a legacy shaped as much by shame and silence as by innovation and progress. In the quiet of that private space, far from the ballroom, the street, or the parlor, one truth remains unchanged across time. The body speaks, and we, in our own ways, must answer.
This obsession with discretion reached into every detail of bathroom culture. Euphemisms flourished. A woman did not say she was going to the toilet. She was retiring, withdrawing, or powdering her nose. A gentleman excused himself for a moment of refreshment. Language itself was reshaped to avoid even the shadow of impropriety. Architecture followed morality. The new water closets, when installed, were often placed far from living areas, tucked in corners or annexes, as though the mere presence of such a device might pollute the atmosphere of refinement. Entire households were designed around the principle that the body should remain invisible. For women, the weight of this morality was even greater. The female body was seen as fragile, delicate, in need of protection from vulgarity. Yet it was also held to stricter standards of purity. A lady was not supposed to sweat, strain, or even hint at the fact that she possessed the same biological needs as men. To admit to such things was to risk not only embarrassment, but moral suspicion. Was she truly refined if her body betrayed her? The irony, of course, is that the stricter the rules became, the more elaborate the rituals required to maintain them. Chamber pots hidden in ornate cabinetry, retiring rooms staffed by silent maids, water closets disguised as furniture, all were inventions born not simply of necessity, but of morality's demand that the body erase itself from view. And yet, within this repression lay the seeds of something new. By turning the bathroom into a private, hidden space, the Victorians helped invent a concept that shapes our world today: personal privacy. The idea that certain acts belong to the individual alone, shielded from the public gaze, owes much to the moral codes of the 19th century. We may laugh at the absurdity of women balancing over pots in steel cages of fabric, or men disguising their bodily needs with euphemisms. But when we close the door of a modern bathroom, locking it behind us, we are heirs to the same Victorian impulse: to separate the polished face we present to society from the realities of the body. Thus, the story of Victorian bathroom etiquette is more than a curiosity of history. It is a mirror, showing us how deeply morality, modesty, and privacy are entwined, and how the simplest of human needs has shaped the very architecture of our homes and the language of our lives. For the elegant lady in silk or the gentleman in tailored wool, the rituals of relief were shrouded in discretion, but someone had to face the reality they refused to acknowledge. That burden fell on servants, the silent workforce who bore the smells, stains, and indignities of Victorian bathroom culture. The chamber pot, so delicately disguised in mahogany or porcelain, was never emptied by its owner. Each morning, housemaids crept through bedrooms, collected the covered pots, and carried them down back staircases reserved for servants. The task required both strength and subtlety. A dropped pot, a spill on the carpet, a trace of odor — any of these could mean humiliation or dismissal. For large households, the scale was astonishing. Dozens of pots might need emptying each day, their contents sloshing in buckets as servants hurried toward the backyard or the slop closet, a grim chamber where waste was dumped and scrubbed away. The work was repetitive, dirty, and invisible. A lady might glide through her day without once considering the hands that dealt with the aftermath of her modest discretion. In the cities, another group bore an even heavier load, the night soil men. Before sewer systems were fully established, cesspits beneath houses and public privies had to be cleared by hand. Under cover of darkness, gangs of men descended into pits with shovels and buckets, hauling out tons of waste to be carted away. It was a brutal, hazardous work, marked by injury and disease, but essential to the functioning of urban life. Few professions carried greater social stigma. Servants inside the home faced a quieter but equally crushing burden: silence. They could never acknowledge what they did. A maid who carried away her mistress's pot was expected to behave as though it were empty, as though the human body itself had been erased. To speak of smells, stains, or accidents would have been unthinkable. The higher the rank of the household, the more rigid the demand for invisibility. This burden also had a moral edge. Waste was not only dirty, it was shameful. For servants, that shame rubbed off on their labor. To clean chamber pots was to occupy the lowest rung of domestic service, a task given to the youngest, most powerless girls. It was a daily reminder of hierarchy, written in odor and humiliation. And yet, this hidden work was the foundation of Victorian refinement. Without servants to carry pots, scrub stains, and manage the flow of waste, the delicate dance of modesty had collapsed. The shimmering ballrooms and polished parlors of the age were built quite literally on the unseen labor of those who...
The irony, of course, was that men had it easier. Gentlemen could slip outdoors or into simpler facilities with little fuss. Their clothing permitted freedom. Their rituals required no choreography. The burden of discretion, of grace under pressure, fell almost entirely on women. And so the retiring room was not just a practical solution. It was a microcosm of Victorian society itself, where appearances were everything, labor was hidden, and the performance of elegance masked the body's inconvenient truths. But no performance lasts forever. By the late Victorian era, new technologies began to challenge this elaborate system. The introduction of indoor plumbing, water closets, and flush toilets promised liberation from chamber pots and retiring room rituals. Yet these innovations brought their own anxieties, their own codes of etiquette, and their own impact on the architecture of the home. To understand this shift is to witness the beginning of the modern bathroom and the slow dismantling of the porcelain ballet that had defined an era. By the mid to late 19th century, whispers of change began to ripple through Victorian households. The age of the chamber pot was slowly giving way to something new, something revolutionary: the water closet. At first glance, the water closet seemed nothing short of miraculous. A porcelain bowl, connected by pipes to a supply of running water, could wash waste away with a simple pull of a handle. No more maids balancing covered pots down back staircases. No more commodes disguised as furniture. For the modern-minded, this was liberation in ceramic form. And yet the transition was far from smooth. For many Victorians, the water closet was not only strange, but unsettling. The idea of a waste pipe running directly through one's home raised anxieties. What if foul smells crept upward? What if disease traveled back along the pipes? After all, this was an age of cholera outbreaks, when miasma theory, the belief that foul air spread disease, still gripped the public imagination. A chamber pot, discreetly emptied by a servant, seemed safer than a mysterious device that gurgled in the walls. Etiquette, too, had to be rewritten. With a chamber pot, everything was hidden, both the act and the aftermath. With a water closet, sound itself became a new concern. The flush, loud and mechanical, was embarrassing, a public announcement of a private act. In respectable households, toilets were placed in tucked-away corners, separate from bedrooms and parlors, sometimes even outdoors in annexes, to preserve discretion. Despite resistance, technology pressed forward. By the 1880s, advances in plumbing and sewage systems made the water closet more reliable. Wealthy homes began installing them as symbols of modernity and status. Architects adjusted floor plans to include dedicated bathrooms, a term that previously referred only to spaces for bathing. Slowly, the bathroom evolved into the private, specialized room we know today. But adoption was uneven. In grand London townhouses, one might find water closets with polished mahogany seats and gleaming brass handles proudly displayed to guests as emblems of progress. In rural cottages, meanwhile, the chamber pot remained.
Finally, the resolution. The chamber pot was withdrawn, its lid secured, and the layers of fabric lowered once again into their perfect dome. A maid might sweep the skirts into place, smoothing them as though nothing had occurred. Within moments, the woman could return to conversation, to a card game, or to the dining table, her face composed, her dignity intact. To the outside world, there was no trace of what had transpired. It was a routine of necessity, but it was also a test of composure. To manage this act without betraying discomfort or haste was the hallmark of refinement. Those who faltered, who rustled too loudly, who flushed or fumbled, risked not just embarrassment, but whispers that might haunt them in drawing rooms for months. Victorian society judged harshly, even in matters that should have been private. And yet, within this ballet lay an extraordinary kind of resilience. These women did not merely endure their circumstances, they mastered them. They transformed necessity into ritual, discomfort into art. In doing so, they upheld a standard of grace that astonished even their contemporaries. Writers of the period often remarked on the elegance of women who seemed to float through ballrooms, never hinting at the effort beneath. Behind that effortless image was the constant practice of this hidden choreography. It is tempting to think of this only as absurdity, as comedy at the expense of the past. But there is also something deeply human in it. These women faced obstacles designed by fashion, by society, by expectations they did not create. And still, they found ways to adapt, to survive, to maintain dignity. Their ballet of fabric and discretion is a testament to the unyielding human instinct for problem-solving. But this delicate dance was not confined to the privacy of home. In the public eye, at balls, at dinners, at grand events, the challenge grew even greater. For then, a woman's bathroom routine became not just a secret act, but a full-scale operation requiring specially designed rooms, watchful maids, and the absolute mastery of timing. To understand this, we must step into the glittering world of the Victorian ballroom, where even the most elegant waltz was punctuated with the quiet logistics of necessity. A Victorian ball was a theater of elegance. Chandeliers blazed with candlelight, orchestras filled the air with Strauss, and skirts as wide as small tents swept across polished floors. Everything shimmered with grace. And yet, behind the gilded doors of these gatherings lurked a problem as ordinary as it was inescapable. Where could a woman go when nature called? The solution was the retiring room, a sanctuary tucked away from the main hall, where women could vanish without explanation.
To the uninitiated, it appeared a space for rest, furnished with sofas, mirrors, and delicate refreshments. But its true purpose was far more pragmatic. Within its discreetly arranged corners stood commodes fitted with chamber pots, concealed in fine cabinetry. For a lady, the journey from ballroom to retiring room was itself a performance. She would rise from her chair with poise, signal a maid or companion, and glide from the room as though seeking nothing more than a breath of air. Never would she admit, even to her closest friends, that she was headed to relieve herself. Language was carefully coded. She was withdrawing or freshening up. Words like toilet or pot were unspeakable in polite society. Inside the retiring room, the act became a team effort. Maids stationed there were experts in silent assistance. They moved with the efficiency of a pit crew, helping women navigate their voluminous skirts, sliding chamber pots into place, and managing the mountain of fabric so their mistresses could maintain composure. All was done without eye contact, without comment, as though the body itself did not exist. In large events, this backstage ballet became a kind of quiet assembly line. Several women might occupy the room at
Yet the drama was not only in the logistics of maintenance, but in the act itself. A Victorian woman could not simply lift her skirts and sit down as we do today. She was wearing, after all, the equivalent of 20 pounds of fabric, a steel framework, and a corset that constricted her movements. Relief required a technique, a choreography of fabric and patience. The chamber pot would be slid carefully into position beneath the skirts, often guided by a maid or by the woman herself if she was alone. Layers of fabric had to be gathered and shifted, not too high to risk exposure, but just enough to allow access. The crinoline hoops were maneuvered like the arms of a machine, tilted to create space. Then, with careful placement and steady balance, the act could be completed, all without removing a single layer of clothing. To an outsider, it seemed impossible. To a Victorian woman, it was simply another part of the daily performance. We might laugh today at the image of a woman balancing on porcelain beneath an avalanche of fabric, but for them it was an art form of discretion. And in this art lay power. A woman who managed her chamber pot gracefully, without accident or visible struggle, upheld not only her dignity, but her family's social standing. A misstep, a faint noise, or, God forbid, a visible odor, could undo years of cultivated reputation. Consider, too, the symbolism of these objects. To modernize, they are relics of inconvenience, but in their time, they were objects of necessity, and sometimes even of pride. Wealthy households ordered chamber pots decorated with fine patterns, gilded rims or monograms. Some families commissioned sets, matching their china and furnishings, as though to say, even in our most private needs, elegance reigns. The chamber pot was more than a vessel. It was a mirror of Victorian values. Ingenuity cloaked in propriety, function disguised as art, necessity hidden behind layers of silence. It was both omnipresent and invisible, acknowledged only in whispers, yet central to the mechanics of daily life. And this was only within the home. In public spaces, at grand events, the challenge multiplied. For then, chamber pots became part of an even larger operation, one involving entire rooms designed for secrecy, and maids trained in the precision of silent assistance. To glimpse that world is to understand the bathroom as a social ritual, as much performance as necessity. To watch a Victorian woman relieve herself, if one could watch without scandal, was to witness a performance that combined engineering with art. What to us is a private, instinctive action became for her a carefully rehearsed ballet. Every step, every adjustment of fabric had to be carried out with precision, lest dignity slip away along with modesty. Imagine the layers that stood between body and porcelain: shifts, drawers, petticoats, crinolines, overskirts, outer garns, ribbons and lace. Together, they could weigh as much as a small child. There was no simple lifting of skirts. Instead, a woman learned to navigate these barriers with techniques passed down quietly from mother to daughter, from maid to mistress. It was a choreography as secret as it was essential. The first movement was positioning. The chamber pot, oval and discreet, was slid beneath the vast dome of skirts. For this, a maid might crouch at her mistress's side, her hands invisible beneath the fabric, guiding the vessel into place with the delicacy of a surgeon. No words were spoken. They were not needed. Centuries of unspoken etiquette had created a silent language of gestures and glances. Next came the adjustment of layers. The woman would shift just enough fabric to clear the way, gathering folds in her hands or discreetly lifting with her elbows, all while keeping her body upright and composed. The corset made bending nearly impossible, so movements had to be economical. Small tilts, careful lifts, subtle rearrangements. The goal was not speed, but discretion. The act itself should be invisible, swallowed by the vast expanse of fabric. Then came balance. With the steel cage of the crinoline pressing outward, the woman perched as though suspended in air, ensuring the pot was in the right place, neither too far forward nor back.
And yet society marveled at the spectacle. Illustrations in fashion magazines showed women as if floating, skirts billowing like clouds. The reality was far less ethereal. Bruised ribs, sore shoulders, and the constant drag of fabric across the body. For many women, life inside these garments was a performance of elegance under duress. They were expected to maintain smiles, witty conversation, and poise while their very clothing worked against them. Still, the human mind adapts. Over time, Victorian women developed extraordinary skill in maneuvering their portable architecture. They learned to glide through narrow doorways by turning sideways, to rise from chairs without displacing the hoops, to dance with partners who carefully adjusted their steps to accommodate the vast sweep of skirts. It was a choreography learned by necessity, a ballet performed daily in homes, theaters, and streets. The larger question is why? Why did women endure such discomfort, such impracticality? Part of the answer lies in symbolism. The crinoline was not just fashion, it was status. Its sheer size declared that the wearer did not labor, did not need to move quickly, did not belong in the working world. To wear such a structure was to embody leisure, wealth, and respectability. A narrow skirt suggested poverty or vulgarity. A wide one proclaimed dignity. In a society obsessed with appearances, the crinoline was a walking billboard of propriety. But there was irony here too. The more a woman's clothing immobilized her, the more she was confined to the domestic sphere. A crinoline made long walks difficult, outdoor labor impossible, spontaneous play with children nearly unthinkable. The very garment that elevated her status also reinforced her dependence on others and her restriction to controlled spaces. Fashion was not just about beauty, it was about control. And yet, inside these cages of steel and fabric, women lived entire lives. They ate, laughed, wept, read novels, hosted dinners, and attended balls. They adapted. They endured. They even found moments of joy within the absurdity. One can imagine a group of women in a withdrawing room, skirts brushing against each other, sharing quiet laughter at the awkward mechanics of their clothing, private humor hidden beneath public decorum. But beneath the laughter lurked a more practical question, one whispered in corridors and never voiced in polite conversation. How does one relieve oneself when imprisoned inside a steel cage of skirts? If every movement required calculation, how could a woman possibly manage one of the most basic human needs? The answer lay not in the public eye, but in the hidden chambers of the home and in the discreet ingenuity of chamber pots. And it is there, in porcelain and wood, in the quiet service of household staff, that we find the next chapter of this story. If the corset was the tyrant of the Victorian wardrobe, the chamber pot was its reluctant savior. For beneath the mountain of fabric, beneath the crinoline cage and the swaying layers of petticoats, the human body still made its demands. And in an age before flush toilets became widespread, the chamber pot, humble, hidden, yet indispensable, was the solution. But don't imagine a crude bucket tucked in a corner. These pots were not afterthoughts. They were carefully designed objects, adapted to the peculiar challenges of female fashion. Women's chamber pots were often oval in shape, their interiors
Curated symbol of virtue, status, and restraint. And the clothing was not merely decoration. It was a constant reminder that every gesture, every movement, even every breath was subject to scrutiny. To dress was to accept battle, not against an enemy army, but against the demands of society and the constraints of fabric. Every hour of the day would be shaped by these garments. What she could eat, how she could sit, whether she could run, even how she might relieve herself when the time inevitably came. Fashion was not passive. It was active restraint, an invisible chain. And yet, women embraced it, or perhaps endured it, because to reject it was to reject respectability itself. By the time a Victorian woman stood fully dressed, she was no longer simply a person, she was a construction, a fortress of linen, steel, and silk. The admiration of society would follow her, but so too would the unspoken question that lingers with us even now. How did she live inside this? How, bound so tightly, weighed so heavily, could she manage the everyday necessities of the body? That is where the real ingenuity begins. For once a woman was encased in her fabric fortress, every practical act of life, sitting, walking, eating, and yes, using the bathroom, became an elaborate choreography. To understand how she survived, we must now step inside the world of living in mobile architecture. Once a Victorian woman was fully dressed, she carried more than fashion. She carried architecture. The crinoline did not merely frame a skirt, it imposed itself on the world around it. A woman wearing one did not simply enter a room, she transformed the room. Doorways narrowed before her, chairs became obstacles, staircases became hazards. With every step, she had to measure the world against her expanding silhouette. Some of these crinolines stretched nearly 6 feet across, wider than the shoulders of most men. To sit in such a contraption required strategy. A lady could not simply lower herself into a chair. She had to perch at its edge, balancing her cage as if she were negotiating a piece of unstable machinery. In drawing rooms, furniture was arranged with these enormous skirts in mind. Sofas were set farther apart, chairs designed with more depth. Certain homes even commissioned custom pieces of furniture, settees with no arms, wider benches, and circular stools to accommodate the sweeping span of steel hoops and fabric. Public spaces, too, felt the strain. Passing through a crowded theater or navigating a narrow city street became feats of negotiation. 2 women in full crinoline could not walk side by side on a pavement without risking collision. A sudden gust of wind could flip the skirt skyward, turning grace into spectacle, and leaving both the wearer and bystanders scandalized.
Stories circulated of crinolines catching fire from open hearths or becoming trapped in carriage doors with tragic results. Beneath the elegance was danger. Beneath the beauty was absurdity. But the challenge was not only physical, it was psychological. Imagine carrying 20 pounds of fabric and steel for hours at a time, the weight tugging on your waist, the corset compressing your lungs, the constant awareness that one misstep could undo the dignity you had labored to construct. Every movement became a calculation. To descend stairs, one had to gather layers of skirts in both hands, lifting them just high enough to avoid tripping, yet low enough to preserve modesty. To enter a carriage required twisting and folding the crinoline like an enormous mechanical puzzle, sometimes with the assistance of a footman. The simple act of bending to retrieve a dropped glove became an ordeal of balance and precision.
Picture yourself trying to answer the most basic call of nature, not in the quiet privacy of a modern bathroom, but inside the suffocating layers of Victorian fashion. Imagine being bound in a corset that compresses your lungs until every breath feels like a negotiation, while a skirt the size of a dining table engulfs you in hoops of steel and cascades of fabric. The very clothing that was meant to display elegance and social status has become a fortress of fabric, an architectural prison. Now, imagine realizing you have to use the bathroom. How do you even begin? This was not a small inconvenience. For Victorian women, what we consider an unremarkable daily ritual was instead a high-stakes puzzle, a test of discretion, strategy, and ingenuity. And society demanded perfection. A lady was expected to glide gracefully through drawing rooms, to waltz elegantly across ballroom floors, to sit through endless dinners, all while ensuring that no one ever suspected the complex realities of her bodily needs. Failure was unthinkable. Embarrassment was social death. That tension between the relentless demands of nature and the suffocating expectations of propriety creates one of history's strangest mysteries. How did women of the 19th century manage the most intimate functions of life while dressed like walking monuments to fashion? The answer is ingenious, sometimes shocking, and always revealing of a society that cared more about appearances than practicality. But before we unlace the secrets of chamber pots and the hidden strategies of Victorian womanhood, pause for a moment and consider where you are as you hear this story. Perhaps you're watching from the comfort of a modern home, with a bathroom just steps away, a door that locks, running water at your fingertips. The gulf between our everyday ease and the Victorian woman's constant strategizing could not be wider. And yet, across centuries, across continents, here we are, still fascinated by how human beings, in all times and places, find ways to navigate the unchangeable truths of the body. That fascination is exactly why this story grips us. History often parades kings and queens, wars and revolutions, but in the quiet corners of daily life lie the stories that make us gasp in recognition. After all, no matter the era, every human being faces the same needs. What changes is the theater in which those needs play out. And in the Victorian era, the stage was both magnificent and absurd. Glittering chandeliers above, chamber pots hidden below. To enter that world, we must first appreciate the context. The 19th century was a time of contradictions. It was the age of industry and innovation, yet also of crushing social rules. Railways stretched across nations, telegrams carried words at lightning speed, and cities swelled with modern ambition. But for women, the domestic sphere was a cage as real as the steel hoops that framed their skirts. Clothing was not just fashion, it was ideology, stitched into fabric. A women's dress declared her respectability, her family's wealth, her conformity to society's demands. And within those elaborate gowns,